Welcome everybody to the Shine Expert webinar series. This is webinar 4 in our series, and we're delighted to welcome today Dr. Margaret Sutherland and Dr. Ines Alves, who are both from the School of Education and the College of Social Sciences at the University of Glasgow. And Margaret is the Director of Postgraduate Research and also the Scottish Network for Able Pupils. Ines is the Programme Director of the Masters in Inclusive Education, and both have huge research interests in inclusive education and working with our young people in schools. So today the theme and the expertise that they're going to share with us is along the theme of supporting the well-being of pupils who require additional support for learning in an inclusive school environment. So I'm delighted to have Margaret and Ines with us here this afternoon. For those who are still joining, I see the numbers are still coming up as people sign in. Just a reminder that obviously with the webinar format, you can see us, but we can't see you. But there'll be an opportunity at the end to type in questions to the Q&A box and to interact with Margaret and Ines once they have given their presentation first of all. Okay, so without further ado, I am going to hand over to Margaret and Ines. Ines, if you'd like to share the slides. And we're very much looking forward to your presentation. There we go. Okay, and if you'd like to unmute Ines, there we go.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. It's a big pleasure to have been invited to speak to you. We started conversations around the idea of well-being, and we realized that there were lots of common interests in the well-being of young people, and we assumed that if you're joining us, that's one of the areas that you'll be interested in. As Dawn just told you, both Margaret and I are based in the School of Education, and as we were preparing this presentation, we thought it's always difficult to know who will be there, what would be interesting for people joining us. So we tried to prepare something, and we're also looking forward to your questions and to the discussion after. Margaret, I don't know if you want to say anything.
Hi, I'm Margaret. I think I know at least one person here. Susie, if you're the Susie I think you are, I've not answered your email. I'm sorry. I will do, I promise. And hello to everybody else. And I think Ines has kind of summed up who we are and what we do. And as she said, I too am really looking forward to the discussion that we will have. I'm assuming that, well, yeah, Fran has put something in the chat. So if you do have any thoughts as we're talking, please feel free to pop them into the chat and we can pick up on those when we get to the Q&A bit at the end.
Okay, so we thought that actually what we would start would be by telling you what we think when we think about inclusion in education. Because sometimes when we work in the School of Education, for example, even our colleagues think we're talking about, for example, students with disabilities only. And we would say that actually when we're talking about inclusion in education, we're thinking about these 3 key aspects. The first one being access to education for all students, and access not only in terms of the physical access, which is what we would traditionally be thinking about, but other barriers to access, for example, language. If you've got students who've recently arrived to Scotland who might be struggling with language and accessing learning, and for a number of other reasons, that students might experience barriers in accessing education and learning. The second one is participation. And when we think about participation, we're talking about not only the mainstreaming, which is sometimes what inclusion becomes associated with, being in the same room with others, but actually we're talking about feeling part of something, and being part of something that in some cases for some of our children and young people, at some points it might mean actually not being in the same room and doing the same things as others. And the final one is success. And I think we'll pick up on this notion, or what we mean by success, or what success can mean, and that it can mean different things in different documents, policy documents, and practice in schools. But that's one of the key aspects. It's making sure that children and young people are not just physically present in the school, but they're working towards something, trying to achieve something, and something that's also meaningful to them. The second aspect that we thought is that when we think about inclusive education, one of the key aspects that's really, and if we look at international documents, one of the key aspects that's really important for us to take into account is that it's a process. It's not something that you can say this is an inclusive school and we can lie down and have a rest. It's something that we, as inclusive practitioners, we work on a daily basis, and we think, okay, who experienced barriers in this session or in this class? What could we do differently? The International Bureau for Education and UNESCO have designed this diagram, and basically what it shows is that there's a number of different aspects that play a key role if we want to develop inclusive education systems and schools and classrooms. The first one is concepts. And if we think, for example, about Scotland, the concept, and we'll touch on this later on, the concept of additional support for learning is a broad concept compared to, for example, special needs, which is a concept that's used in other countries, which can be both a positive or a negative thing. The second aspect is policy, and policies have a huge impact on what we do. What's expected from teachers, from local authorities, what's funded, what's not. And they also impact on the third aspect, which are structures and systems. And for example, if we think about different countries, you will be and have different systems, different structures that young people are expected to attend, depending on, for example, whether they've got a label or not. And the final one are practices. And I always tell our students in the Masters in Inclusive Education that you may work in a context where the concepts and the policies and the structures are excluding learners and creating barriers to lots of learners that you work with, but you can still create an inclusive ethos in your classroom, in the context you work in. So practice is a key aspect when we're trying to develop inclusive education.
And I think the other thing to bear in mind is that it's not practice singular, it's practices plural. So there is no one magic bullet here, there's no one thing we do that will guarantee inclusion. There are many ways. In fact, we can do things thinking we're being incredibly inclusive, and in actual fact, it leaves the young person feeling completely excluded. So it's a very slippery concept, and that's actually what makes it quite exciting, but it's also what makes it blinking difficult, and probably even more difficult in the current context that we're finding ourselves in. But I would also argue perhaps even more important in the current context that we find ourselves in.
So today we decided to structure our presentation using Martin Rose's, in one of his publications, he proposes that if we want to have inclusive practitioners, we need to focus on 3 aspects. And we thought we'd start with this. It might take us somewhere else, but we would start with this framework. And so what Martin says is we need the head, the heart, and the hands, and we'll talk you through it and give you some examples as well. So the first one is the head, not because it's the most important one. It's that they're all equally important. And with the head, what Martin Rouse proposes is the knowing and all the different things that practitioners, educators, teachers need to know. They need to know about their content knowledge, the contents that they're teaching, and these are important. They need to know about pedagogy, how to assess learning, how to identify difficulties, how to manage their classroom. So lots of different aspects of knowledge, the policies of the context they work in, but what and how to find help when needed, because what I think everybody who works in education knows is that every year we'll face different students with very different life experiences and needs and characteristics. And so it's really impossible for us to know in advance what we should do with each young person. So finding help, whether it's online or by chatting to a colleague or the local authority, it's really important. And what Martin says is that content knowledge, all of this knowledge is important, but it's not sufficient. So the other two aspects are also relevant. Margaret, I don't know if you want to come in. We'll move to...
No, you're fine. Keep going.
Okay. So one of the key aspects we mentioned about the knowledge is the policies. And if we think about Scotland, and you can probably tell I'm not originally from Scotland, both from my name and maybe by the way I speak. And if I look at the policies in Scotland, they're very inclusive. They're very good policies, very strong policies in general. If I think, for example, in terms of the concept of additional support for learning, that takes into account not only within child characteristics that then might push teachers to think, what do I need to do to fix this child? But also all the context aspects, all the environmental aspects that play a key role and can create huge barriers to learning. And you've got a list there.
I think you can also probably tell from my accent that I am from Scotland, and given my age, I've also been around a long time in Scottish education, and I remember the days before 2004 when we started to talk about additional support for learning. And of course the reason that we started in 2000 to talk about this and to change was that what we had been doing in the past from 1978 in the Warnock Report up until 2004 was all about the record of needs. It was a very, very different way of thinking about and understanding the idea of special education. And we weren't getting it right. And it was right, I think, that we looked at that in line with the Standards in Scotland School, etc. Act in 2000, and started to think about what do we mean by additional support for learning. I would argue that Scotland has really, really good policies. Where the problem for me comes is that gap that can sometimes exist between the policy and then what happens in schools. And also what is possible to happen in schools and what's allowed to happen in schools. So the gap, and I quite often think of myself of having spent my life working in that gap between the policy and the practice and trying to bring those bits together.
So that's always one of the key challenges, I think, when we work with teachers is very often almost a feeling of frustration when we tell them, look, Scotland has really good policies, and you have the teachers who experience challenges on a daily basis of actually responding to the students' needs and for support and to actually empower them to learn. So I think that's always one of the challenges. If we look at Scottish policies, again, they link inclusion with the notion of well-being. So for example, Curriculum for Excellence has this idea that curriculum is not just about learning to read and numeracy and literacy or English and maths. It's wider than that, and it should encompass all learners. And if you look at the 4 capacities that are expected for schools and for learners to develop, they're kind of inclusive in principle: being successful learners, being confident individuals, responsible citizens, and effective contributors. So that in principle, they could be really inclusive.
But we've got to ask some hard questions about these things, I think. What do we mean by a successful learner? Is it somebody who leaves with 5 Highers and goes on to university? Is that how we are thinking of measuring and talking about successful learning? Dawn mentioned at the beginning that I'm the director of the Scottish Network for Able Pupils, who of course come under this legislation in Scotland. And there are many people who have gone on to do very well and been very successful, however we want to measure that, whether that's in finding new cures for cancer or whether that's in making money. But some weren't that successful at school. I used to be a behaviour support teacher, and I worked with some very confident individuals who used to come in, you know, the kind of kid. And some of that confidence was actually a bit misplaced. So what exactly do we mean by confident individuals? Responsible citizens? Are we kind of really hoping that is, what does that mean? What citizenship? Is that actually about getting them to think critically, and therefore can being responsible actually question what's happening? So there's lots of things in here. And what's an effective contributor? If it's purely measured in economic terms, then we're going to have people that won't contribute. So in that way, it's worth unpicking these and actually thinking exactly what we mean. I see there's a comment here in the chat. We'll maybe pick up on that. Fulfilling the potential. That's an interesting one. And I'm so glad that you didn't say full potential, because that really worries me, because I'm not sure how we measure that, and I'm not sure what happens when you reach it. Yeah. Stop learning, pours out your head over the top. Or as somebody once said, he's working well beyond his full potential. I've yet to work out actually how you do that. So yeah, so lots of things for us that we can get into debates and discussions about.
So again, picking looking at another key Scottish policy, GIRFEC, getting it right for every child. Again, if we think of it, it combines the idea of well-being being one of the key aspects of education in Scotland. It has this idea of joined up working that we think is essential. If you want to be inclusive, you can't work in isolation. You need to work with others. You need to share difficulties and ideas and materials. And so again, if we look at, for example, GIRFEC and the associated framework, Shanari, usually it's called the Shanari wheel. I'm sure you'll be familiar with it. In principle, all of these values are very inclusive, and they should help schools become more inclusive places. If we think that the aim is to have children and young people who are feel safe and healthy and are achieving, so all of these are really good starting points. I think that the question here, and I know, Margaret, we said we probably wouldn't go there because it's a very dangerous place nowadays. It's well, sometimes what happens is that in schools, teachers are expected to negotiate a number of priorities, and well-being may be a priority, but getting national 5 results or school results is also a priority. And then it's how you negotiate this and what counts and what comes first.
And I think for some high label young learners that I work with, then in actual fact, ensuring their health and well-being is actually by ensuring that they get the right, appropriate, challenging work. And if they don't get that, it's actually that affects their health and well-being. So there's lots of questions to be asked here as well around this whole issue of health and well-being and what it means for learning learners and ultimately what we do in schools.
So I really like this. This is a training material to use with educators, and interestingly, it's been designed and developed based on the one day. So it starts, if you look at the picture there, it starts before school, getting to school, arriving at school, and this is one of the things I think it's really important, because very often when we're planning or thinking about schools and whether they're inclusive, we think about the students from the gates in. I think COVID made us think about a lot of what happens outside the school gates. And I think more and more we become aware of this, that if a child comes to school in the morning, they didn't have a uniform to wear, they didn't have breakfast, the journey to school was shouting or fighting, or nobody was there to take them to school, for example, if they're younger, all of this will have an impact on how ready the students will be, the children and young people will be to learn when they get to the classroom. Margaret, do you want to come in?
Oh, sorry, no, you're doing a good job, keep going.
I'm looking at the time and noticing that it's 20 past. So moving on to the second aspect in that framework is the heart, and this second aspect, I think it's the idea that teachers, practitioners, educators need to believe both in their students' capacities and in their own. I like the quote in the article. It says, they need to believe, or we need to believe, that all children are worth educating, that all children can learn, that the teachers have the capacity to make a difference in children's lives, and that such work is their responsibility and not only a task for specialists. And I think it's really important. I think the first thing is to realize the impact that teachers can have in young people's lives, and also the idea that everybody in the classroom is the teacher's responsibility, and not a specialist that is expected to come with a magical solution and sort it all, because most often there aren't any magical solutions. So that's the second aspect.
There's an interesting point in the chat here about this notion of the whole child and linking to that European framework, you know, sort of knowing about before and during and after school and so on. And I think you're absolutely right that we, as teachers, we do need to be aware of these things. But I think we also need to know what we can have, if you like, control over, and what we can affect and what we can do. I know that when I was a behaviour support teacher, for example, one of the 8-year-old boys I was supporting on occasion slept rough at nights. And at first, I used to lie awake at nights worrying about this. You know, is he under the hedge tonight? Oh my goodness, listen to the wind and rain. And I kind of quickly realised it was actually affecting my health and well-being. And in order to be any use to that boy, I needed to be there in the morning. I needed to have had a reasonable night's sleep. I needed to be ready to welcome him in whatever state he arrived. And there was, other people, other organisations, social work, etc., were involved. And you need to also decide, what are the bits I have control over? We can't fix everything as much as we would like, perhaps, to fix everything as well.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that happen out with the school that having the awareness will help us interpret and manage things differently in the classroom, but we can't really fix a lot of those things. The reason why we've included this slide, and you've got a link, and the PowerPoint will be shared, you've got a link to a YouTube video, and this is the outcome. The link is Alison Peacock, who used to be a primary head teacher, and she talks about one of the experiences in her school. But part of this is the outcome of a project called Learning Without Limits. And one of the key aspects is this idea of the huge impact of teachers' belief in their students, in their abilities, and what Alison Peacock in the video calls allowing the children to surprise us and the young people to surprise us, because sometimes we have these preset expectations, and they have a huge, or can have a huge impact in then how the children will behave and perform in school.
I think, just to be clear, that idea is not saying that all children are the same. It's not saying that all children need the same. It's not saying that you might not have a child in your class who's, you know, I don't know, 10 or 12 or 15 or whatever, and struggling with reading, and equally you might have one in your class who's 10 and reading like a 25-year-old. It's not saying that. That's not what it's saying. It's asking us to think about learning and learners in a way that allows us to support them wherever they're at. Yeah.
And I think one of the key aspects here is linking it to pupil voice and to getting to know our learners and trying to understand, and building relationships is really important. And I think, again, if we think about the present situation in COVID and all it brought, I think, to light even more the importance of relationships, and how that impacts the whole process of teaching and learning. We move on to, because I'm checking the time, move on to the last aspect, and the last aspect are the hands, and the doing, turning knowledge into action, for example, through school and classroom-based action research projects, by listening to the pupil's voice, and by collaborating with colleagues. And again, if we think about well-being, I think what Margaret brought up is we need to think about our own well-being as well, and collaborating with others, and feeling that it's not just on us as individuals. We need to work with others to feel supported and make it happen. 5 minutes, yes. We decided we're looking at feedback from some of our students in the Masters in Inclusive Education, and this is one of the things we felt, is that this idea of the hands and the turning knowledge into practice is really, really important.
Can I just clarify that these our Master's students are all qualified teachers, with many of them working in Scottish schools, although we do have some international teachers with us as well, but they are all teachers, practicing teachers, who are back to do additional qualifications.
Yes, and so I think one of the things it's very, very clear from the feedback from these teachers is that this notion that you can have all the knowledge but then struggle to apply it to the classroom for a number of reasons. And so this idea of being analytical of situations that happen in the classroom, and continuing to strive for best teaching practice. So the idea that you can't do it all in one go, but you have to have this analytical, critical analysis always in action when you're in school. And that sometimes small changes, and sometimes we wait for kind of top-down approaches that come and tell us what to do, but sometimes small changes in the teaching or the curriculum or the pedagogy can benefit not only the learners that have been identified as having additional learning needs or additional support, who need additional support for learning, but they usually benefit all learners in the classroom. So this was just one of the aspects, is this idea that you can have all the knowledge and still not do very well in the classroom, and the bridging this gap of knowing the policy but then actually feeling that it's okay for someday you plan the perfect session and then it goes terribly wrong, and that's part of the process. But as inclusive practitioners, it's this idea of questioning our own practices and thinking about what are the power imbalances in the class, in the school, for example, and how can we shift those. But this is tricky, difficult, and sometimes heavy work.
I think that last quote for me is the one where it is a place where I would really like us as a profession to be, where we're looking at individual pupils, learners, we're assessing how their needs can best be met, and I might have to take an alternative view to what I think. I might have to have more confidence to question the status quo, because I think it's that statement there for me encapsulates what I think we really need to do so much more of in schools. Where both Inish and I are incredibly conscious of the challenging situation that you are all, if you're from schools, are all working in at the moment. I do think, as challenging as it is in life, across life, COVID for me has shone a big light on all the bits that were not quite right before, but it offers an opportunity to do something different moving forward. And that maybe takes us to our picture. If you follow me on Twitter, I actually put that picture on Twitter. So yesterday, the day before, I had been working at my computer with my head down all morning, and I lifted my head up, looked out my window, and I saw this rainbow, and I thought, yeah, it is a rainbow. It is, isn't it? And it may be dim, but it's there. I think there is hope. I think there are many challenges that we're facing just now, but I think there is hope, and if we pull together, if we work together and have our head, heart and hands at the forefront of what we do, then I think there is an opportunity to do what we all want to do and make things better for all learners.
And that's it from us, and now we hand over to you, Dawn.
Thank you very much to both of you. Wonderful insight into your work, and lots of things there that I'm sure people will want to discuss and think about in a little bit more detail. So if anyone has any questions, please do put them in the Q&A box and we'll pick them up from there. Obviously the chat box has been going throughout, so if you have particular questions that you would like me to put, if you could put those into the Q&A box, then I'll be able to see them a little more clearly. So some comments coming through in the chat.
Alexandra's just saying there that we have view that we do things that way because we've always done it that way, and it doesn't necessarily need to be that, doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way, and I think you're absolutely right. But sometimes having the confidence to try something different, I think for me there's a real role here for senior management in a school. I think schools need to give teachers permission and make sure that teachers know they can try things and know they can change something and know that they can do something different because of the situation they find themselves in. And you know what it's like, you can do something one year and it's brilliant, it works so well. And so you do it again the next year with a different class and it's a complete disaster. And of course what's changed are the learners in front of us. So there's, again, that no one sure way of anything.
So you mentioned obviously COVID has really unsettled so many routines and so many lives for both teachers and children. Is that sort of coming through in your work in terms of thinking about strategies in relation to that, in relation to sort of inclusion?
I can certainly share some things from some parents that I've spoken to. I get emails, phone calls, I've had Zoom calls with many parents throughout the pandemic and since going back to school. And maybe Anish, after I finish, you want to pick up on what our masters people are saying. So I certainly think that yes, I think there is concern. I I think I've also had schools contact me, and I've also seen comments on Facebook from teachers where I think there's been a realisation that children have come back, and some have learned loads of stuff and have, you know, access way beyond what they might have been doing if they'd been in school. And there's that whole sense, I think, that schools are now in this position of having to respond to that. And I think, you know, I think what I am starting to see now, certainly in the people that I'm speaking to, is that attention is now saying, okay, so where's learning in the midst of this? How do we support learning? Which is what teachers and schools are about, supporting learning. So I've seen a few things starting, I think, to come through in the conversations and the questions that I've had. Also from parents whose children have not attended the facilities that they would normally, daycare facilities they would normally go to, and haven't been there since March. There's a national issue with that. I'm involved in with a group in England where there's great concern over children with severe and complex learning difficulties, and adults for that matter too, where these places just shut down and have not opened again. And the impact of that on the young people, but also on the carers, has been huge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And Ines, were you going to add to that?
I think what COVID has shown us is that the expectations the society places on schools and teachers are much higher than just the teaching it, just as if it was an easy thing to do, but just the teaching and learning. And I think that's what we saw when and every time, I mean, we're going in Glasgow back to level 4 lockdown, and there's still huge concerns about closing schools, and some of it might be learning, but I think a lot of it is much more than that, is what will some of the children be accessing if they're away from school, even free school meals, for example. So that, I think that one of the things COVID has shown us is that the huge range of things that happen and are expected from schools and teachers. And I think the other side is how difficult it is to reach some learners, for example, if we're moving to online teaching, and how difficult it is to keep the relationships going with online teaching because of the sense of community that develops in schools. That is very difficult to mimic or to reproduce online.
Mm-hmm. And I think schools have done an amazing job throughout. They really have. So just looking at the chat.
Yeah, there's a link there from Fran about some materials from Education in Scotland around particularly dyslexia, and there's various things. The National Improvement Hub has stuff on there for supporting that as well. It's quite interesting because I think we've also had to think, looking back at some of the stuff that's been produced pre-COVID, and then kind of thinking, okay, does this change or can, you know, is there anything we need to do? Because some of the things that we might have done physically, for example, for high label learners, isn't possible because they're not in the same bubble and they can't do it. So there's lots of ways, I think, where we need to look at what we were doing and the good practice that was there and say, well, you know, do we need to now make some tweaks there? There's a question too, I think,
from authorities, right?
Yeah.
I think, the role of, I'd say the role of local authorities in general, apart from the local authorities officers, but that's one of the things we notice when we start speaking to some of our students, again, teachers, many of them, most of them, I'd say teachers in Scotland, is the huge impact that local authorities' decisions have in their practice, in the school policies. And we see huge variations from one local authority to the next. I think that's something that, for example, looking at statistics in England in terms of the existence of special schools and the placement or inclusion, depending on the perspective, of students in mainstream schools differs hugely from one local authority to the other. So it's so clear from examples, individual examples, but also from research, the huge impact that sometimes small decisions from local authorities have in what actually happens in schools.
Yeah.
So some great links being shared here. I'm just taking a copy of those so that obviously when I circulate the recording, then we can put a link to these as well. So thank you, Fran, for keeping those coming through.
That idea of being overwhelmed by information is right. I think, and it's all done often with the best of intentions to help, but it is the kind of stop. I mean, even within our university at one point, I was thinking, oh no, what now? Which, oh my goodness, another document I've got to read and think about. And again, all done with the best of intentions to help. And I suppose it's coming back down to that kind of, excuse me, well, what do we need to think about here as a school, and doing it together as a school as well, I think. I'm a little bit concerned about some of the language that's been around COVID in relation to learning, the whole catch up, to what and with whom. You know, I'm really not sure. And I'm also worried it could potentially actually result in a whole big focus only on maths and literacy, maths and numeracy. So literacy and numeracy, that's the words I'm looking for, sorry, literacy and numeracy. And I worry about that too, because I think if we are looking at that whole child, then it is about the arts and the aesthetics I'm so with you on the singing one. I have a children's choir that I haven't met since March, and I met one of the little girls. She was at the school gate as I was passing with my dog, and she went, "Oh, Margaret," and she turned to her friend, she said, "That's my choir teacher," and then she turned and she went, "I miss keynotes," and I was nearly standing crying. I go, "So do I." So yeah, I'm with you on that. And there's so many things that young people have had to change and adapt to, as well as teachers, you know.
Absolutely, and it really does bring home the relationship and community that's just so important in a school. Okay, so I'm just scanning here to see whether we have any more questions or observations.
Pick up on that, Fran's comment here about that, the local authorities, and there is, I think you're absolutely right, I think there is also something really good where a school can contextualise and an authority can contextualise things, and it's just, and so I think there's a lot of strength to that. The problem is if things can start occasionally to slip through cracks. I think maybe that's where the issue comes. But I think there's the two sides of that, I think, absolutely.
Absolutely. Okay, and so I'm just having a look, just making sure that I haven't missed any questions, but I think
got a couple of questions that just came through now.
If we want to stretch more able children, how do we get the balance? That's a good question.
I'm not quite sure I'm understanding what you mean by balance. Highly able children need challenge. We need to look at in a sense, what we do with them is no difference in one sense than what we do for any other child. We need to look to see where their learning is, and we need to move them forward from where that place is. And we need to look at them as a whole child. I think it can be tempting sometimes to say, what can they not do, and let's help them with that, and we need to do that, but not at the expense of kind of the pause button and the bit they can do. It's again about back to that whole well-being. It's about the whole child. I mean, the Shinari wheel actually works so well for highly able learners. So I'm not sure exactly what you mean by balance. You'd be welcome to email me later as well if you want to talk more about that.
And
Susie's question?
Yeah, Susie brought up the idea that sometimes, and I think, Margaret, it will be something that you find a lot, is that some people think that we need to support weaker students who are struggling, but the students who are highly able
get on in spite of us.
Yeah, and I think actually if we think about inclusion in education, we need to start from a human rights approach. And it's the right of the child to education, and if you think of and again, Margaret, you'll have a lot of, I think, contact with research that tells us that a highly able student who's not challenged will have all the other aspects that will come in. Will have behavior problems, disengagement from learning. And so actually we need to respond to the needs and to the characteristics of each individual.
Which I think is a good place to take us, because as we're kind of coming, I'm guessing, to the end here, because I think it is about a rights-based model and not a needs-based model. Because the truth is, I think, that if it's a needs-based model, probably highly able are going to miss out all the time, because people will say, well, they need it more than they need it. But if we come at it, this is a rights model, everybody's a right to an education, then we can't make that argument. And so I think that is a really good way to look at it. And highly able learners they can also be multiple exceptional. So those links, for example, that Fran put in there to dyslexia, fantastic, because some of your dyslexic learners may also be highly able. The characteristics between autism and highly able, big grey area in the middle, so that there's that whole notion of what's known as multiple exceptionality that we need to think about too, which I think is really, really important. And yeah, I mean, they have mental health issues. I have a friend who's runs a research centre in America, and he's looking at the correlation between suicide and high ability. So they're not this kind of special group that don't have any of these issues that they have the same issues as every other child, and they go through all the hormone stage and all the stuff that we do as human beings,
Yesterday, I don't know if any of you attended the Solveson lecture, which is organised by the University of Edinburgh, but they did a huge study, or they have been working with a large cohort of young people, and that have been that they don't have labels, they haven't been formally diagnosed with anything really, but they've been identified by teachers or other staff members to be part of this study. And what they've been looking at is the characteristics, learning characteristics, brain characteristics of these learners. And then some of them went on to get those diagnoses. And one of the key findings of this study is that actually by knowing what the label, the diagnosis that a child has, it won't tell us much about the learning characteristics or the learning profile of that learner. So yeah.
I've just made another connection with somebody. With Fran. Do you know, I was sitting here thinking, I wonder if that's the Fran that I met in Optima House. And I think it is. So great.
Excellent. Okay. So it is indeed, and that's always nice when people can connect through these webinar sessions. Excellent. So I think we have come to the end of our questions. Thank you very much to all our participants that have been very interactive on the chat this afternoon. That's been great, sort of just driving those conversations this afternoon. Very many thanks to Ines and Margaret for your presentation and your sharing your expertise this afternoon. It's been a really interesting session. So without further ado, I think we will call a close to this webinar, this fourth webinar. And as said previously, we will share the slides, and obviously I'll highlight those links as well that have been shared by Fran this afternoon. Okay.
And
so
we just
thank you again.
By also thanking you all for coming along at the end of a day. It'll be a hard day, I'm sure. And also just to thank you for all the work you're doing for all our young people in our schools. Yeah, there's no better job in many ways, but it's a very hard job anyway, and it's probably even harder at the moment. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, and with that, we will close the session. Thank you to all.
Thank you.